Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for part 4 of what we're calling an Introduction to Black Church History. Introduction to Black Church History. Each time I begin this, I want to begin with scripture, but for those who are just watching for the first time, welcome. Thank you so much for actually tuning into this. The reason we are doing this is kind of in honor of Black History Month. Every day we're sharing a little bit on Black church history to help you who are watching learn a little bit more about Black history. So I want to begin with verse 26 of chapter 1, Genesis. And you'll kind of see why I'm beginning with this. Genesis chapter 1, verse number 26. Here's what it says. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So that's Genesis chapter number 1. Where God says, let us make man or mankind in our image. This is an important piece for part 4 of our introduction into Black church history. One of the reasons why white Christians, we shared in part 1 that Christianity had definitely been on the east coast of Africa, but in the around 1400, 1440 or so, Portuguese sailors went up the west coast of Africa. And one of the reasons why many of those white Christians used to justify the slave trade was to save the souls of those who were being enslaved. And to help you understand, I want to read a quote by a man by the name of Gomez de Azara. And he was a chronicler of the time, of the kind of the great expansion time, the great discovery time period. Here's what he said about it. He said, "The greater benefit belong not to the Portuguese adventurers, but to the captive Africans. For though their bodies were now brought into some subjection, that was a small matter in comparison to their souls, which would now possess true freedom forevermore." This is important because England, Spain, France, Portugal, even the Netherlands, they all said that one of the reasons they need to colonize really the world was for missionary purposes. We got to convert more people. However, there's a little bit more to this because we would have religious wars when you would have had the Reformation, and so some people are Catholic, some are Protestant, and so depending on which country you were from, you wanted more people to be like you, and so their colonizing the world also showed up in how they would spread their version of Christianity. So, for example, in North America, which is what we're talking about now, in the 13 colonies, the British king, he sent instructions to the governors in the 13 colonies, and he said to them, instruct the Negroes, slaves, and the Indians in Christianity. The reason was because Spain and France were beating them kind of in the missionary game, and so they needed to do a better job. And so instruct your slaves, instruct those savage Indians in Christianity. Slave owners, though, did not care about Christianity. They did not care about the soul of the slave. They only cared about the money. They only cared about the dollar bill. They only cared about their bottom line profit. And so they didn't want to convert their slaves. And one of the major reasons it became economics was because for those in the 13 colonies, there was a British law that said if a person were baptized, he or she would be emancipated or become free. So if I baptize my slave, I lose him or her as a slave. And I lose the profitability of this person. And so they rebelled against baptizing or converting slaves because they felt like if I baptized them, they would be emancipated. That's the slave owner. So new laws came out, just specifically dealing with a person who was a slave, saying if they were baptized, it did not mean they would necessarily be emancipated. So that assuaged the slave owners from saying you won't lose your profitability. Right? But then another problem showed up in that, well, when do we teach them Christianity? When they're working sun up to sundown, Monday through Saturday, and the only day they have really free is Sunday. And I shared with you in our last episode that on Sunday, that little bit of downtime, they would dance, they would go visit family, or some of them had to work their own land and make their own clothes because the slave owner did not provide for them. They gave them one day to provide for themselves. Okay? And so now if you're going to get something to eat, you got to go out and plant something for yourself. If you're going to make some clothes, make it for yourself, but do it only on Sunday. And so there was very little time to Christianize slaves. And so when they had the merriment, they would go doing the ring shout, which we talked about on our last episode. When they had their downtime, a lot of the missionaries then began to say things like dancing was sinful, so that slaves would not be able to practice that on Sunday. Then, even after they got past that, there was another big problem. And that problem was the humanity of the black person compared to the humanity of the white person. If a black person can be saved, if the slave can become a Christian, it would suggest at some level then that they are human. The problem was slave owners did not view their slaves as human. They didn't even view Indians or Native Americans as human. They viewed them as some other species, or that 2/3 of a human, or 3/5 rather, of a human kind of thing. They were not human. They were chattel. They are not human, and so they cannot become Christian. And so one Puritan preacher by the name of Cotton Mather, here's what Cotton Mather said. Cotton Mather, M-A-T-H-E-R, you can Google his name. He wrote this tract called The Negro Christianized in 1706. And he's writing this trying to, in essence, defend the humanity of the slave to the slave owner. Here's what Cotton Mather said, 1706. One table of the 10 Commandments has this for the sum of it: thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Man, thy Negro is thy neighbor. 'Twere an ignorance unworthy of a man to imagine otherwise. Yea, if thou dost grant that God hath made of one blood all nations of men, he is thy brother too. The slave owner did not want to view the slave as his neighbor because that would suggest that the slave was equal to the slave owner. And so that also became a challenge. And this is then when missionaries had to come up with a new way of Christianizing the slave, or at least a new reason for allowing assuaging the issues with the slave owner, a new reason to get to the slave. And so the missionaries then came up with a plan that said a Christian slave would be a better slave. When the slave owner had a concept that if you Christianize my slave, then my slave would begin to view himself or herself as equal to whites, and in that understanding of equality, they would become saucy or uppity and arrogant and uncontrollable if they view themselves as human and equal with men. So the missionaries came up with a new marketing scheme. And so I want to read to you a statement by a man named Winthrop Jordan. This is kind of how he described what the missionaries did in his book, White Over Black. He said this: these clergymen had been forced by circumstance of racial slavery in America into propagating the gospel by presenting it as an attractive device for slave control. Missionaries, because of the concept and the understanding of the slave owner, had to come up with a way of saying, if you allow us to Christianize your slave, they would be a better slave for you, they would work harder for you, and ultimately make you more money. This is important because here we can see with the missionary who are trying to Christianize slaves and the slave owner, there was a disconnect. There was some, even early on, such as Cotton Mather, who was trying to argue at least the humanity of the slave, where the slave owner only cared about their money. Now, this leads us into what's called the invisible institution. We're kind of creeping into that now in how black slaves practice their Christianity when some slave owners never wanted their slaves to be Christians. Because if so, there was a threat that this slave may view himself or herself as equal with a white person, and therefore they'll become uncontrollable. All right, that's it for today. I generally try to keep these 10 or 15 minutes. If this has been helpful for you, just part 4 of it. If you missed some other parts, go back. Definitely take a look at those. If it's been helpful, do me a favor. Go ahead, share it with somebody else. The goal is to, again, post these every day for Black History Month as an introduction, at least, to Black church history. So we learn a little bit more about how we got to where we are today. So please do share it. If you've got comments or questions, go ahead, leave them there in the comment box, or shoot me an email, pastor@upliftmd.com. I generally try to highlight a book or two, and so I want to highlight these 2 books on today. This one is called Black Religion, Black Theology, the collected essays of J.D. Otis Roberts. I mentioned him to you once before, and this one is called Risk of Faith, the Emergence of Black Liberation Theology by James Cone. And the reason I highlight both of these is because they were both theologians, and they kind of sparred with one another with regard to the best way forward for Black Christians. And so both of these books are really kind of their collected essays. This one here was really compiled by James Cone himself. And so if you want to read some of his early writings, this is a good one, Risk of Faith. And this one right here is a collection of J.D. Otis Roberts' essays compiled by a great friend, great brother, David Emmanuel Goatley, who is the Executive Secretary for Lot Carey Foreign Mission Convention. So great reads. Again, Black Religion, Black Theology, the collected essays of J.D. Otis Roberts, and Risk of Faith by James Cone. Some books that may be helpful for you. All right, God bless. Peace.